Every summer my family traveled across the country to visit our relatives in Minnesota. We had moved far away to Washington State when I was 5, and my parents were determined to keep our ties to our family. Strong. It was a two-day road trip, and I grew tired of driving for hours and hours in the backseat of the 1970 Pontiac Catalina, but I also looked forward to seeing my cousins and investigating their 100-year-old farm. We explored every part of their farm. We climbed into the old red barn to play tag in the hayloft. We pried open the doors of several old railroad box cars used as storage containers. They were filled with rusted items, cans, and old furniture stored away and forgotten. We climbed trees, played kick the can, and rode bikes up and down the old farm roads. Sometimes we braved their dark and damp basement. I was dared to go to the middle of the room, turn off the lights, and count to 100 before running back up the steps with a scream. I ran up the steep steps to the safety of the lighted hallway within the first few moments. Most of the things we did were part of our yearly routine. I loved it. I never wanted to divert from these adventures every time I stayed. The visit was always memorable. It made me feel like I still belonged to the farm life. Even though I'd moved 1,000 miles away, it was comfortable, and I looked forward to reliving these fond memories every summer. We did this every year until I turned 9 that year. My dad hurt his back at work and he couldn't travel. When I finally came back to Minnesota in the summer, I had turned 12. Things were different now. I was a preteen, and the things we had done as kids were now not as cool. Instead of exploring the farm, I wanted to watch the black and white TV, listen to Billy Joel records, and talk sports. Things had changed. I had changed. I was bored. That's when my cousin told me about a forgotten graveyard he had discovered. Of course, I was going to see it. We would set out in the morning, hike across the Minnesota landscape, and reach the graveyard by mid-afternoon. We would then be able to return home before dark. We got up before anyone else, made sandwiches, and headed out. We traveled through cornfields, quarries, and wooded fields. We ate our sandwiches by a small lake. There are 10,000 lakes in Minnesota, many without names. We finished our lunches and headed on. The graveyard was hidden under a humongous rose bush. I carefully entered the canopy and saw the first tombstone. It was dated in the 1800s. I soon saw the second and third tombstone. Everyone buried had the same last name. This was a family graveyard farmers from many years ago had sanctified by burying their kin for many years. It was now forgotten and overgrown. My cousin pointed to an area I hadn't yet explored. I saw 7 small white tombstones with lambs above the inscription. They were children who had died from the same disease, like smallpox or yellow fever. I was saddened as I imagined their pain the parents must have felt burying all their children. I felt embarrassed to have disturbed their peaceful rest. With a sobering silence, we headed back to the farm. We retraced our steps through the woods, the quarry, and finally the cornfields. Everything looked different in the shadows of the setting sun. I was getting a little worried that we wouldn't make it home before dark. I was so excited to see the farm in the distance. A thunderstorm was approaching. As we walked into the kitchen at supper, I answered questions about the hike with the bare minimum details. We ate and then headed up to his bedroom. Something was different. I felt it. I hadn't just gone on a hike. I had stepped into a sacred place. I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to listen to music and go to bed. I woke up to the sound of moaning. Dark storms always roll through Minnesota in the summer as cold air masses chase humid air with thunder and lightning. But this didn't sound like a storm. I looked out the window of the darkened bedroom. The wind blew through the farmyard, and objects were noisily moving back and forth. Then the lightning flickered above the ground and revealed the landscape for a split second. In that flash of light, we could see something. I was convinced I could see children darting back and forth in the grass. I woke up my cousin and ran back to the window. The lightning flickered again. He saw it. There were children dashing from place to place, moving towards the house. I didn't believe what I was seeing. I wanted to run out of the room, but I couldn't move. It was obviously our imagination. But why were we both seeing it? If we ran to get help from our parents, they would only point out that we had been to a graveyard, and it was now playing tricks with our minds. We waited until the lightning and thunder moved on before getting back in bed. The moaning died away with the storm. Cool air was now coming into the room, and we drifted off to sleep with the lights on. I woke up in the dark. Either the power had gone out or our parents had turned the lights off. While we were sleeping, I didn't move. I wasn't going to check the light switch. The moaning had definitely stopped. That was good. I was suddenly overwhelmed with the feeling of sadness. I don't know why all those children dying, the parents must have been devastated. I suddenly became aware of movement in room. It couldn't be my cousin. He was sleeping in the bed next to me, hearing the sound of footsteps running back and forth across the floor, or made my blood turn to ice. Was this a dream? The footsteps continued in the night. My cousin didn't wake up, so I was on my own once again. Sadness was all I could feel, even more than fear. I could only think of the pain of the children and the parents I had experienced in that graveyard. I did the only thing I could think of. I whispered, "I'm sorry." I don't know if I was sorry for their pain or for disturbing their rest in that abandoned cemetery. I said it over and over. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I must have fallen back asleep. I woke up as the sun was coming through the window. I laid there until my cousin's mom called us down for breakfast. We went downstairs and were informed that the power had gone out in the night. The weirdest thing was when our parents asked if we had been running around upstairs in the night, they'd heard footsteps. My dad purchased a small farm on the edge of a forest several years ago. This farm has a tiny farmhouse, which Dad decided to make his permanent residence. However, my mom and sister chose to continue living in the city due to my sister's schooling. So Mom and Dad made plans to have overnight visits every month. The very first time that my sister and Mom arrived for their overnight stay, it was the middle of a heat wave, and Dad had to utilize his specialized sprinkler system for his crops. The land and the farm had been so dry that even the creek flowing next to the farmhouse completely disappeared, and cracks were forming on the dirt around the base of the farmhouse. Dad was very worried about the weather taking a toll on his crops, so he watched the Weather Channel after dinner, while my sister and Mom went into separate bedrooms to get ready for bed. My sister was laying on her mattress, texting a friend, when she heard footsteps initially. She thought Dad was done watching TV and was getting ready for bed too. But when she heard the footsteps repeatedly shuffling between her bedroom door and Mom's, she thought it was very strange that Dad didn't open the doors nor knock, so she got up and opened the door to take a look. The moment the door opened, the sound of shuffling footsteps stopped. She saw Dad, who was still in front of the TV, already sound asleep and snoring away on his recliner. Mom's door was shut, and it didn't look like Mom left the room. She closed her door and lay back down on her mattress. Just as she was about to text goodnight to her friend, she heard those shuffling footsteps again. This time, she realized that the footsteps sounded wet, like someone who got their clothes and footwear drenched at the beach, and are making that moist pitter-patter on dry solid ground. She turned to look at the gap under the door, and with the illumination from the ceiling light outside, could see shadows from a pair of feet that were very rapidly shuffling itself back and forth between my sister's door and Mom's. She got up to open the door again, but like the first time, the footsteps stopped immediately, and all she saw was Dad comfortably snoring in front of the TV. There was no footprint, wet or dry, and no one else but Dad and her. She called out to Dad, trying to wake him up, but Dad was in such a deep sleep, he just continued snoring. My sister felt a little freaked out, so she shut the door, laid back on her mattress and pulled her blanket over her head. She called her friend to talk so that she could drown out the sound of those footsteps and to provide soothing company until she fell asleep. The next morning, my sister asked Dad if he heard anything during the night. Dad said he heard nothing because he slept so soundly all through the night. She then asked if Dad ever experienced anything strange while living in that farmhouse. But Dad said no. In fact, that farmhouse was the most peaceful place he'd ever lived in. Then she asked Mom if Mom heard anything, to which Mom also said she heard nothing despite being a light sleeper. When night fell, my sister decided to not go to bed after dinner. Instead, she wanted to accompany Dad in watching the Weather Channel so that she could stay awake to see what was making those footsteps. Just a couple of hours later, Dad, as expected, fell asleep on his recliner while watching TV. Mom had already gone to bed. My sister sat next to Dad, fully alert, watching and waiting for anything unusual. Then she heard those quick soggy footsteps. However, this time the footsteps were coming from the kitchen. She turned to peek into the kitchen, and to her horror, saw a very tall, pitch black figure pacing back and forth on the kitchen floor. She described it as so tall, it almost reached the ceiling. It was really skinny, like a stick figure that had been stretched out. with a narrow head that had no facial feature at all except for pitch blackness. Whatever ghost, monster, or entity that was, it just hastily paced back and forth in the kitchen while making those sopping wet footfalls. It didn't pay any attention to my sister nor Dad. My sister, with her eyes still on the mystery figure, grabbed Dad's shoulder to try to wake him, but Dad just didn't budge. He stayed asleep and kept snoring, as though he was in a drug-induced slumber. She then ran into Mom's room surprisingly. Mom, who has been a light sleeper her whole life, didn't stir at all when my sister entered. Mom remained sound asleep. Even when my sister jumped onto her bed, my sister kept her eyes on the bedroom door for the rest of the night, refusing to shut her eyes until sunrise. When morning came, my sister begged Mom to bring her home. Dad was disappointed because they were supposed to stay another night and help out around the farm during the day. My sister, who has a serious neurological disorder, told Mom and Dad that she was not able to sleep at all in the farmhouse, thus putting her health at risk. Eventually Mom relented, much to my sister's relief. It has been several years since my sister witnessed whatever that was in my dad's farmhouse kitchen. My sister refused to spend the night at my dad's farm. No matter how late it gets during their visit, she never told Mom nor Dad because she didn't think they would believe her. To this day, Dad lives in that farmhouse so far. He has never reported anything spooky nor strange, even when Mom stays overnight with Dad. Mom never experiences anything out of the ordinary. So, Darkness fam, what do you think that was? Hallucinations, hauntings, heat stroke, hell's portal, hysteria?